and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Gina is Cree and Saulteaux and a member of the Star Blanket Cree Nation in Treaty 4 territory. She's the principal investigator of the Prairie Indigenous Relationality Network, and her research takes up questions of treaty implementation, Prairie Indigenous life, gender, and Indigenous feminism. Welcome, Gina. Dallas Hunt is assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literatures at the University of British Columbia. He is Cree and a member of the Wapsipipi, or Swan River, First Nation in Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta. He has had creative and critical work published in the Malahat Review, ARC Poetry, Canadian Literature, and the American Indian Culture and Research Journal. His first children's book, Awasis and the World Famous Bannock, was published through High Water Press in 2018 and was nominated for the Elizabeth Razik Cleaver Canadian Picture Book Award. His next book, Creeland, will be available through Nightwood Editions in March 2021. Welcome, Dallas. And finally, we have our own University of Guelph Professor David McDonald, who is a mixed race Indo-Trinidadian and Scottish political science professor at the University of Guelph, and is from Treaty 4 lands in Saskatchewan. His research focuses on comparative Indigenous politics, genocide studies, and settler colonialism. He has a Shark Insight Grant, Complex Sovereignties, with co-researcher Cheryl Lightfoot, on Indigenous practices of self-determination in comparative perspective. His recent publications include The Sleeping Giant Awakens, Genocide, Indian Residential Schools, and The Challenge of Conciliation, published by University of Toronto Press in 2019, and Settler Silencing and the Killing of Colton Boushie, Naturalizing Colonialism in the Trial of Gerald Stanley in Settler Colonial Studies. So welcome again, David, and thank you for moderating today's discussion. So we've asked today's panelists to discuss their recent book, Storing Violence, Unravelling Colonial Narratives in the Stanley Trial, published earlier this year by ARP Books. And you'll find a link in the chat if you'd like more information at the book. So once again, welcome everybody. Welcome to our speakers, and over to you, David.
Okay, thanks, Joanne. And thanks so much, Gina and Dallas, for joining us today. This is the book, and I hope all of you will have a chance to buy it and read it. And there's lots to learn from it. I understand too that the proceeds of the book are going to Colton's family, which also is another good reason to buy the book as well. So it's just great to see a good-sized audience, and also to see Gina and Dallas again. A lot of people from Ontario followed some aspects of the trial. In 2018, there was a big vigil or gathering to stand with Colton in front of City Hall in Guelph here. But in a general sense, I don't know how much most people in the room will know a lot about the trial, and also the killing of Colton Boushie. So I was just wondering if you could perhaps outline some of the context of the book, and maybe what inspired you to write, because I think that would be useful, maybe a useful way to get started today.
Sure. So we wrote this book after having published an article, just an op-ed, very short op-ed in the Globe and Mail, which we put together during the trial, literally as we were listening to some of the narratives that were circulating in the trial. And so Dallas and I were both really interested in this sort of question of which facts are seen as important in a trial, which are seen as relevant, and which will resonate for an all-white jury. And I guess conversely, which parts of the encounter between Colton Boushie and Gerald Stanley that day were not seen as important by the courts, were not seen as relevant, and certainly wouldn't resonate for that jury. But I think one thing that we were really interested in was how all of that which was being bracketed off, right? Questions of race, alternate versions of events, alternate histories, that sort of backdrop of settler colonialism that Indigenous people feel and experience every day in their lives in the prairies, how none of that really factored into the trial. And so what we wanted to do, both with the the op-ed, and then later with the book, which was sort of an extension of that, was we wanted to illuminate some of those histories and feelings and stories that for Indigenous people in the prairies, that's very real. That's part of your everyday life. But then you're continuously told by settler institutions that those are irrelevant, that they had no part in what transpired that day, right? And that they can't even really be accounted for when Indigenous people are trying to seek justice through these systems, when an Indigenous person has literally been killed, and no one's denying, that Stanley shot Colton, right? But there's all these, I think, various ways in which Indigenous lives or Indigenous life in the prairies was very much not factored into that case, and the narratives that were at play in that case. And so what we were trying to do was bring those to light while also problematizing the sort of settler narratives and the story of, what Gerald Stanley was doing that day and what his, what his family life constituted. We were trying to problematize those as well. And, why are these sort of really problematic narratives of this knight protecting his castle, et cetera, et cetera? What are the histories and lineages of those stories of settler life in the prairies? And how can we sort of trouble or deconstruct those tropes?
Yeah, so I think Gina just spoke really well to the content of the book and sort of the impetus behind it. I think in a very pragmatic, like the sort of practicality, the sort of logistics of producing a text like this was that we wrote the op-ed, and we got a good response to it generally, and then a few presses sort of reached out to us, and as that was happening, there was another book that was in production that we didn't know about, which was the Kent Roach book. And so there was a point at which I was still at the University of Manitoba teaching in the Native Studies department, and Jade Tutusis, Colton's sister, sent me a message on Facebook and said, do you know about this book? Because there's a talk at the University of Manitoba about a book that is about my brother. And about this entire thing, and like, what do you know about it? And so it was a very sort of jarring experience, because then I looked up the event and I looked up the book, and I had no idea that this book had been in production, or that another press and academic press elsewhere had been working with Kent Roach. And again, this isn't I'm not this isn't a smackdown on Kent Roach, but rather is more just to say that there are particular ways of working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous families in particular, and especially when they have deep investments in particular events, this one being pretty obvious as to why that would be the case. And it just seemed to be that no consultation with the family had occurred. None of these very important things that I think we as Indigenous peoples hold very close to us, which is, talking, visiting, just making sure that we're actually getting on with one another and processing things of this nature. None of that had occurred with that text. So that was, I'm not going to say that's the impetus for the book. Like we had a wide array of reasons why we would write a book like this, but it certainly it sort of motivated us a little bit to make sure that the family's voice was out there, and that's why Jade is in the introduction, and Debbie's voice, right? Colton's mom is in the book as well. So yeah, those were part of the sort of logistical components of the text.
Yeah, because I mean, that to me, I think is part of the most powerful aspect of the book, is the way that you've worked with Debbie, with Jade, with their lawyer, Eleanor Sunchild. So I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit about that, like how, like, did the family approach you? Did you approach them? Did you know them beforehand? And how is it to work with a family who's undergone such tremendous structural violence and such devastating loss, and then to produce a publication out of that? I'm just curious as to how it worked with the family. Like, did you talk to them on a regular basis? Did they look at different things you're writing, and like, how does that process work? Because it's absolutely fascinating to think about that.
I just very briefly, I knew members of the family sort of tangentially. So I knew one of Milton Tutusis was somebody that I was close with. And if you watch Tasha Hubbard's film who also writes the preface, he gives a very rousing sort of speech in the film about all of those things. So I knew Milton, and through Milton, I knew Jade Tutusis. And so when it was all sort of happening, it was a very, it just was something that I immediately felt plugged in by. Gina has done terrific work in terms of working with Jade and others in terms of developing resources for other families that have.
Yeah, so I think with a project like this, like we were approached, as Dallas mentioned, by numerous publishers following that op-ed, and we, from the get-go, we didn't see this as a project that we would take on unless it was something that the family thought was important. And so we had no investments other than, we obviously felt it was an important project, but we weren't wedded to the idea if it was something that they didn't see as valuable. And so we connected early on. We sort of, had initial conversations around what our strengths were. I'm a political scientist. Dallas is a literature scholar. And so he thinks a lot about narrative, about the stories we tell, things like that. And especially the political implications of what it is we're talking about, and why it's important, or why the way in which we talk about Indigenous people is important and is in itself political, right? And so these were some of the things that we told them we can bring to this book. We're not legal scholars, so it's not going to be a legal analysis, but we wanted to make sure that that was in line with the sorts of messaging and advocacy, because of course they were doing, advocacy work at everywhere from very local kind of grassroots levels to international realms. And so this is something that we kept going, that conversation as the book was in development. We shared outlines, we shared the different themes and things that we would take up. And again, just really kept that conversation with Debbie, who's Colton's mom, and Jade, Colton's sister. We just tried to keep those lines of communication as open as possible, while also recognizing that we couldn't connect with them about every single decision, right? Because it would just overburden them as well. And so, there was a number, I think some interesting sort of methodological choices, like whether we would have, the title of the book have Colton's name in it or Stanley's name in it, and ultimately decided not to instrumentalize, Colton's name in that way, because when it comes down to it, neither of us knew Colton, and the book isn't about him, right, and his life as much as Tasha's film is. Let's say, she really integrates a lot of footage with the and interviews with the family, who really do that work of humanizing him and of showing, who he was as a person. Ours was we approached it as a complement to the film, I think, in some ways, and really focused instead on problematizing a lot of those narratives that did have so much traction in the courts. And so, those sorts of choices, we tried to be very conscious of, why it is we're doing this work, and whether that's going to be consistent with the sorts of the work that the family is doing. Throughout, we were also doing other projects with the family. So we developed a number of resources. They're incredibly generous with their own experience and wanting to share that experience in ways that can improve the experience of other Indigenous people who might find themselves in similar situations. And so we created a series of resources for Indigenous survivors of violence and their families, because there is, one thing that they found was that there was an absolute lack of resources when this took place. So it's sort of like a toolkit. It's still just in the final stages of production, but really building on those experiences that they had.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the book being a sort of complement to Tasha Hubbard's film is Tasha was very generous in that she shared with us very early cuts of We Will Stand Up, which is, if you haven't watched it, it's an incredible and heartbreaking sort of documentary, but it really delves into the minutia at times of this case, or of the trial of all of it, right? And not only of what's going on in terms of peremptory challenges and stuff like that, which is a thing that comes up obviously, but also into the family itself, right? And so this is something that we, as we watched the film, we also had, it was very much in our, in the forefront, I think, of our minds as we wrote the book as well, so.
I think if I can just add one more thing, there's so many, in recent years, I think in the past decade, one thing that I've noticed is there's just been such a rapid increase in the amount of writings that take up Indigenous people as victims of violence. And so I think we were both conscious of that sort of tendency and wanting to ensure that if we did this project, we weren't just kind of, you know, approaching Colton's death as this object of study, right, that we're removed from. We didn't want to just relay the horrific nature of colonial violence, which of course it is horrific, right? But we wanted to do something more than that and do something that might prompt settlers and invite settlers to, you know, think through their own relations to the issues that we're talking about and to that encounter that took place on the Stanley farm that day. So part of that was thinking through that violence in ways that illuminate some of those kind of taken for granted structures and institutions and how they serve to uphold and legitimate those experiences that Indigenous people feel every day. So again, yeah, I think that was, we were both kind of, okay, if we're going to write a book that takes up colonial violence, we have to make sure to do it in a really good way, right? In a way that's not just kind of acting as a news reporter on that that violence, right?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, which leads into my question about storying, because I'm just kind of curious about the methodology of storying. Is this something that say Indigenous folks have been doing for a long time? Is it something that like settler people could do as well as a methodology? Like how? Maybe you could just tell us a bit about what the methodology of storying is, if it is a methodology, and then what how you undertook that process, and you know how common it is basically, because it's really, really interesting. It's to me it looks very innovative, but it may be that I'm not reading the right stuff all the time. So
yeah, so I think what we're doing is we're taking, what we're attempting to do in the text is we're taking these large capacious concepts such as, settler colonial violence or just settler colonialism generally, Canadian jurisprudence, all of these things that sort of congregate at this particular moment and produce this sort of, produce the acquittal of Gerald Stanley, right? So so essentially what we're doing is we're taking all of these different threads to all of these different sort of large events and processes that are ongoing and structures, and we're just trying to provide a particular narrative to those structures, right? To actually say, well, this is how we get to something like the acquittal of Gerald Stanley, somebody who admitted to killing Colton Boushie. This is not under contestation. He was one of the first things he said in his interaction with the police. So what we're doing is we're actually, as storying as a methodology, is we're just sort of trying to give a sort of narrative thrust to events that can seem at times confusing, complex, all over the place. It involves history, politics, the sort of social relations, all of these things, especially in the prairies, which are quite fraught. And we're just giving them a sort of narrative sort of voice. So that's the thrust, I think, of at times the notion of storying in the text as a sort of methodology. You asked briefly about settlers, and so one thing I think that's important is that many times what I like to say about the book, or what I like when I'm teaching a course, I don't like it particularly, but it's something I have to do. which is to say that there's a sort of inherited and shared history here, and we need to sort of discuss what that actually looks like. And at times, what that can actually look like is narrating a sort of a history like this. It's at times very fraught or hard for settlers to actually think about how they came to inhabit or inherit a space, right? And in many cases, that involved incredible terrible violence. And I think there's a sort of a reluctance on the part of settlers to really think about, well, how did you come to live in a particular area? Might that have involved a sort of narrative of violence? And I find there is I find that reluctancy of settlers to sort of narrate how they come to inhabit spaces actually quite interesting and at times quite telling, right? Yeah, I think settlers need to know their own stories too, basically.
Yeah, in Saskatchewan and sort of white rural Saskatchewan in particular, there's many tropes about, the righteousness of settler legal and political institutions, the goodness of the people and the industriousness of the people who reside there. And that's not to say that they're all false, but we also have to think about how those narratives get constructed and upheld and seen as true, and what other figures, right? The figure of the criminal Indian, the murderable Indian, or whatever the case, how those figures are necessary for the figure of this sort of industrious, self-made, but also sort of protecting farmer, right? Because they can't rely on the police, they can't rely on the RCMP. So there's a sort of vigilantism and sense of independence and autonomy that I think is really a part of those tropes as well, right? And part of that requires, a particular construction of Indigenous people in those spaces as well. And so we were also trying to illuminate that, right? That sort of interplay between those two figures and how narrative actually produces a sense of those figures as being true and how that materializes in settler institutions like the courts, right? And how then, I guess, just as Dallas was mentioning, how we get to a place where Gerald Stanley can admit to shooting Colton, but then also be acquitted for his death, right? Or for his murder. Even at the level of manslaughter, which of course, this is something that we sort of see this trajectory at first when they're, when they're laying the charges. Many people are upset that it's not first degree murder, that it's not second degree murder in and of its own, but that they also have the lesser charge of manslaughter there. Many legal scholars have talked about, this sort of encounter, normally Stanley would have been charged with a whole litany of crimes, right? Irresponsible use of a gun, all these sorts of assault, right? Various other crimes as well, but he had those two charges of second degree murder, manslaughter, and then slowly we start to see the courts building possible pathways out of a guilty charge, right? And so, yeah, really, I think a part of storying too that's at play here is us showing, like, here's how you get to the point where you can actually admit to shooting an Indigenous person in these spaces and then be found not guilty for that act.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Another aspect of the storying that I think you both do might be in relation to Treaty 6, because it seems like you're storying violence, but then you're also offering throughout a story of Treaty 6 and maybe some alternative narratives of how we could better understand what was going on through treaty eyes. So I'm just wondering if you could perhaps talk a little about the role of Treaty 6, how your book maybe presents a story of Treaty 6 or multiple stories of Treaty 6 that would help us better understand what relations could and maybe should look like in Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think treaties, when you look at Indigenous understandings of treaties in these spaces and the spirit and intent of treaties, it helps sort of confront and collapse a lot of the sort of taken for granted ideas that circulate in the trial, right? And so ideas of trespass or jurisdiction, or, you know, how to live together in a space, that's sort of, there's a number of assumptions that circulate in the trial. And what we do is we sort of pause that representation, or kind of intervene in that representation and say, let's back up here and talk about what justice might look like, or, you know, even what race relations might look like if we think through another normative frame. And that's the normative frame of treaty, which of course informs Indigenous people's understanding of what law and governance should look like in those spaces. They're relationship frameworks. They're supposed to govern how we interact in those spaces. Treaties don't get mentioned once in the trial, right? But for Indigenous people, these are crucial parts of, you know, what is supposed to govern this relationship with the people that we allowed to share this place. But then we also do something a bit different, and maybe Dallas can speak to that. You know, we also kind of trouble this turn to treaty, or this desire to invoke treaty as this sort of harmonious, seamless alternative, because of course we know that there's many, many barriers that stand in the way of, you know, that alternative becoming something even close to reality, right?
Yeah, I think where we sort of, towards the end of the book, where we sort of arrive is this idea of, we wanted to problematize this sort of easy turn to treaties, right? That we both want to invoke treaties and say that, you know, Colton Boushie was in his ancestral homelands, and these are a part of treaties, and we need to actually be attentive to these histories and all of these things. But we're also not looking for a sort of superficial engagement with treaty. We actually want to think through it as an actual relation, right? Not just something that we superficially evoke. I mean, I'm very glad we did the land acknowledgement at the beginning, because this is something that a lot of Indigenous peoples worked very long and hard for to have be a thing. But we also want to actually take something like a land acknowledgement, or just the actual relations that treaties sort of gesture to, seriously. So towards the end of the text, what we actually talk about is what would it actually look like to inhabit and just live something like treaty, something we've all inherited, right? And at times that it appears as though we cannot actually do that as the machinations of something like settler colonialism is at its full sort of operation, right? Because how can you be in a treaty relationship when, as Gina was saying, Gerald Stanley will admit to killing a particular Indigenous youth, will be acquitted for it, and there seems to be a sort of wider, broader public sort of support of this from people in that general treaty area, right? So these two things are sort of in conflict, right? How do we exist in relation, but also well, maybe they're not in conflict, actually. Maybe how do we exist in relation, and maybe we're not if particular institutions are allowing the sort of indiscriminate and sort of impunitive death of particular Indigenous youth, right? We need to think about how institutions facilitate particular things, and if those things don't adhere to the ways that we were relating before, then we might actually have to rethink those institutions.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I was just thinking too, and we chatted a little bit before the presentation began, on the question of genocide and cultural genocide, because the TRC made a conclusion of cultural genocide, which the government accepted, the Trudeau government accepted that. Then we have the inquiry in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which talks about ongoing genocide, and more or less the Trudeau government seems to have accepted that as well. If we look at issues of ongoing genocide, how does the murder of Colton fit into that process? And presumably there are lots of Indigenous peoples who are suffering from the same problems of structural violence, in the sense that this is a nationwide problem that we're seeing. And does a genocide framework, does that help the analysis, or does it just complicate it, do you think?
I mean, I think it can help in seeing elimination and the drive to eliminate Indigenous people, not just as a historic past, but as something that's ongoing. And, you know, it can help us become more attuned to the ways in which elimination occurs in the present day, right? Because of course it looks much different than at earliest contact with Indigenous people, right? This isn't going to, these processes are ongoing, but they're also shape-shifting. They look different as, you know, there's increased recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights, you know, nationally, as our standards surrounding Indigenous rights to land and to life increase and become more heavily recognized at an international level, and that's supposed to kind of bleed down to the domestic level. We start to see, you know, different standards around how states can engage with Indigenous people, the level of rights that they have to recognize, and the level of rights that they need to accommodate and tolerate, you know, to use some of the language of Canadian political science. And over time, what happens then is we see these institutions kind of shifting in that they have to provide that recognition and some sort of political offering to Indigenous people, you know, to facilitate movements out of the Indian Act and other incredibly paternalistic and colonial mechanisms and frameworks. But elimination, that always comes with a caveat, right? It always comes, there's never a full and true acknowledgement of indigenous jurisdiction over our own territories or over our own people. That doesn't come without a caveat, right? And so this is how, pointing to the ways in which these institutions continue to operate, again, to sort of find a way for that violence to become legitimate or to be seen as legitimate. These are some of the lineages that we're tracing, right? This might look a little bit differently, but it's still very consistent with some of the early ways in which colonial violence transpires. Now we have to be a bit more, settler institutions have to be a bit more creative about how, you know, they're continuing those processes and continuing to perpetuate the status quo, even while trying to provide some sort of rhetorical acknowledgement of Indigenous rights or treaty rights, or, you know, a rhetorical commitment to reconciliation in the face of this ongoing violence.
Yeah, I think when I teach about in my courses, when I talk about whether it's residential schools or some of the things, just the whole history of colonial violence that has occurred against Indigenous peoples, I'm actually not a big fan, just to be kind of candid, of the term cultural genocide. It's material bodily genocide that has happened to Indigenous peoples throughout the process of colonization, right? And if you take even any specific example of any residential school or any, there's multiple instances wherein we sort of are confronted with the fact that this wasn't a cultural genocide. It not only was a genocide proper, as it was sort of, you know, ongoing historically or happening in the past, but it's ongoing genocide, right? And if I think we need to take facts like that seriously. And we can look at there have been so many cases since Colton Boushie that have been the death of Indigenous youth, children. Tina Fontaine, Barbara Kentner wasn't a youth, but is now something that's in the courts at this particular moment, wherein we're actually seeing destructive, violent, bodily damage happening to Indigenous peoples. That's cultural in a sense, but it's also, it's very material. It's happening to people. So I think sometimes I think these labels, as Gina was saying, can kind of rhetorically sort of add a little, and I understand this isn't a critique of something like the TRC assessment or something like that. I understand why they need to frame it as something like cultural genocide. And we know with murdered, missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited peoples that, you know, once the word genocide was evoked, it actually created a bit of a kerfuffle. So I think Indigenous peoples in particular know that we need to be strategic in how we evoke these particular terms, but we also think, or not we also think, I think in particular as an Indigenous person that we need to actually, if we're going to use these terms that have been bequeathed to us through particular institutions, I think we should actually take them at their full weight, because sometimes it's genocide. Yeah.
And really the lens of culture is one of the only ways in which Indigenous people are palatable to the state and its institutions and its many of its people, right? Many settler populations. So if we have something like this label of cultural genocide, okay, people are able to acknowledge the sort of damage wrought onto Indigenous cultures through colonialism, but they're not, what that does is it situates Indigenous people only as cultural beings, not as political actors. It blinds us to, in many ways, to our own legal and political resources if we're not actively using those, right? If those are aspects of life that aren't seen as important to Indigenous people. And here I'm talking about the courts, right? How have they interpreted Aboriginal and treaty rights? All through the lens of culture, cultural distinctiveness. That's the sort of imperative for Section 35, right? That's the purpose of Section 35, or how Section 35 of the Constitution has been interpreted in the courts, is through reference to the lens of culture. But what about Indigenous political subordination, right? That gets bracketed off from the picture, from the purpose of Section 35, or efforts to address Indigenous political subordination as an ongoing part of colonialism. So we only then ever see the damage that's taken place on Indigenous cultural life, and then our responses to that as the sort of biggest dimension of settler colonialism that we have to respond to, right? Responses to that then only focus on the revitalization or future protection of those cultural practices, which of course are incredibly important, but there's a whole other part of the picture of settler colonialism that we need to address too. And so I think, yeah, we really try and steer away from that language, or I think both of us, that's not really, we share, I think, a broader commitment to thinking through violence beyond how it occurs at the level of culture and cultural practice, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know Murray Sinclair has said as well that they only said cultural genocide because that was all they could do in their mandate, which, and he's gone on to say he thinks it's genocide, not cultural genocide, but the full UN convention applies. So there's funny slippage, I think, with the way that the TRC wanted to do certain things and wasn't able to do it in some ways. So I guess you've got a few minutes before we take some questions from people, but I think it's incredibly important what both of you said about Indigenous peoples as political actors with political rights. And in the book, so do you tease out and address some of those political questions as well? Like I think maybe through the lens of treaty, you do that to a certain extent, but I don't know if you want to just kind of highlight some aspects of the book, maybe that so some of my students are very interested in political rights in Indigenous nations, for example. So I don't know if there's some areas there that you could highlight from the book that might be of interest to students of politics in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think throughout there's this sort of juxtaposition between, what Canada is offering in the form of justice to Indigenous people through its institutions, right? And of course, these liberal institutions like to think that they're making appropriate space for Indigenous political engagement. But what we do is sort of juxtapose Indigenous understandings of what political life, of what justice might look like, and show that those in fact very much exceed those liberal offerings or liberal desires to kind of tolerate and accommodate Indigenous difference within its institutions. how we invoke Indigenous stories, Indigenous visions of what life on the prairies should have been. We do that in such a way that shows that not only are these institutions just dramatically failing Indigenous people, but that they're actually set up and structured in such a way so as to never provide a means for Indigenous people to flourish in these spaces, right? So I think at one point we were kind of toying with the idea of, okay, well, you know, if treaties had been implemented, we might never have gotten to a place where Colton had lost his life that day, right? Race relations might be substantially different in these spaces. But beyond that, it's not even a matter, I mean, it is a matter of life and death, but beyond that, we started talking about how, you know, it wouldn't have just been that Colton had lived. Perhaps he would have been leading an incredibly different form of life, right? He and his family may have been flourishing in a much different way if treaties had been implemented. And so again, we sort of consistently kind of reject that minimalist understanding of treaty and what treaty could be. And we kind of tried to engage with treaty as that, you know, the most that it could be, rather than that sort of basic minimum of just providing for Indigenous survival in these spaces, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally our orientation in the text or in the book was to sort of, just to frame it through the lens of treaty is, we understand the basic need for survival, especially in the prairies, because it's very hard to be an Indigenous person in the prairies. That said, I think we also want to think through how that isn't the horizon for Indigenous peoples or communities generally, but that's often what's offered to us as our horizons, right? It's just basic survival. And rather, I think what we want to do is we want to think through these aspects of actually flourishing in these sorts of, in many cases, in our ancestral homelands, because why wouldn't we? It's a sort of question that seems so basic, but why would we not do so well in the lands that we've known for centuries or millennia, you know? And so that is one of the ways in which we sort of engage sort of politics. We also we try to present Indigenous peoples as not passive victims, but actually as political actors throughout, right? And I think one way you see this in a very concrete way is through the Baptiste and Tutusis family. Like, you actually see Jade. So if you watch Tasha's film, you see Jade become a political actor incredibly quickly, and in a way that is, she's going to speak to the UN, like she's going to be at the UN, she's going to be just, so I think inherent to us is this notion of politics. And just to sort of dovetail it with the last question is, sometimes what the just distinction of cultural does is it sort of diminishes that kind of work, that we're not, that Jade Tutusis isn't speaking at the UN at an international body about the death of her brother, right? That historically we've been political actors, and in the present we're political actors. And all of the women in the Tutusis and Baptiste family have really shown that, yeah, we'll continue to act politically in spite of what the state and other organizations will do.
Thank you very much. There is an invitation from Joanne to send questions to her. So nothing much has come through yet. So I might just ask another question while we're waiting, which is, because you touched on the family talking at the UN at the Permanent Forum. They met with the Attorney General, with the Prime Minister, so on and so forth. Has any of that produced any tangible results in a positive sense for the family? Like, do they feel it was worthwhile engaging in that process? Yeah, I guess I might just leave it there just to get a sense of what they might have, you know, I know you can't really talk for the family, but maybe just your impressions of whether that process of consulting with the Prime Minister, whether that was Trudeau window dressing and trying to look nice, or whether there's actual commitment, you think, maybe on the part of the federal government. I'm guessing probably not so much on the part of the Moe premiership, but, you know, to actually get to address some of these concerns? Like, has anything positive happened after this debacle that we should know about?
I think, yeah, so my only thing with that is that I would say that less of, if there hasn't been any movement, less of that falls on the family and Jade Tutusis and them, and actually falls more on the political institutions that are constantly failing Indigenous peoples. And there is no way that you could say that the family has not done, a family that was thrown into a situation, right, that they had no experience with, losing a family member and having to navigate not only national bodies but actually international bodies, right, that they have done the utmost to ensure something like justice, or, you know, and knowing full well that these systems rarely produce something like justice, mm-hmm. right, but that they've done the utmost that they can within systems that cause a lot of harm to Indigenous peoples. And if those processes fail, that's less on the family and more on the systems that actually can't deliver those forms of justice.
My sense is that the work that they've done, you know, that my sense is that they're proud of those various processes that they've taken part in to raise awareness, because that seems to be a constant imperative for them, is to bring both the injustice to light, but then also, you know, that advocacy work where they're calling for change and calling for transformation within these processes. You know, that they always seem to be trying to find new venues and ways to raise awareness surrounding the need for justice here. And so, you know, it's really difficult, again, to speak for them as to whether they see that as a success or not. I know that definitely through our conversations, they've learned a lot in engaging with the media and strategies for engaging with the media in a good way, where they're protecting themselves. But definitely, I know that they've continued to take part in that political work. But again, I can't really speak to whether there's any, what they see as, you know, the most rewarding or successful part of that experience.
I think one intervention they had was with peremptory challenges and trying to sort of navigate that as, and it's something you see in Tasha Hubbard's film about, an all-white jury sort of adjudicating, or sort of.
And my sense is there have been changes, but that they're under appeal, or people are questioning the merits of those shifting changes. With some kind of countering that in some other instances, preemptory challenges might actually protect Indigenous people, right? And so we sort of, at the very least, we're seeing these sort of debates and conversations transpiring very much because of that work, right? And their efforts to draw attention to the injustices. And I think that they're important conversations.
Now, we do have a question from an audience member who I think I know personally, but I'm not sure if that's the person because they only have an initial as their last name. But the question is, do you anticipate anything substantive to come from the report coming soon from the RCMP? So I don't know much about this report at all. So maybe you do or don't, I don't know, but.
No, I mean, I think that following the death of Colton and the RCMP's, you know, just terrible treatment of Debbie Bautiste when they went to inform her of her son's death, their terrible treatment of the other Indigenous youth that were in the car that day, one of which was a minor, they did hold an internal investigation and found that nothing had transpired that shouldn't have, or that they had done everything properly. And so I personally have very little faith in these sorts of inquiries. I can't speak for the family or anything like that, but I know that even from the outset, they were petitioning to take this out of province, right? For that very reason, that these are institutions that are, you know, very much invested in their own continuity. And so, again, a lot of these reports, and inquiries, while they might identify the need for, indigenization or cultural sensitivity training or things like that, they're much less likely to identify ongoing patterns of abuse or injustice that are taking place.
Yeah, it's hard to see an institution that conducts a report on itself, or it would be very difficult to see particular forms of or particular institutions to implicate themselves in acts that were wildly or in things that I guess what I would say generally is that just even in the gathering of evidence in terms of this case and how things transpired in that way, a lot, I would say, there were particular things that may have went wrong or didn't go well, and it would seem that an institution like that would not want to implicate itself in a way that was unflattering. So I too share Gina's cynicism, or what I would call my cynicism, in that, I don't really see much coming out of that particular report.
That makes a lot of sense. I could definitely see that. Oh yeah, so there's another question here. Is there training that you would recommend to help non-Indigenous people have a better understanding of Indigenous cultures? But I think we should talk, maybe Indigenous peoples as political actors as well, because I think we sort of dealt with the issue that culture is just not going to be enough in terms of anything. So yeah, I guess it's a question about training from a member of the audience, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, there's a whole host of resources out there, and people, I really just encourage people to inform themselves, both, about the histories of Indigenous people and Indigenous contributions to these spaces, and relationships with these spaces, but also conversely about, settler histories in these spaces as well, right? So again, I think it's about learning about the interplay between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people if we're going to understand the roots of many of these questions and issues, not just about learning about either population on its own, right?
Yeah, and I think we can't too heavily invest in this notion of training and it sort of remedying, being the remedy for all of these sort of issues. I think that what's at stake in many of these things is a sort of very material, certain material and political investments. And I think sometimes what fails to happen is that we think that just, and this is something that I relate to my students, even as somebody who is an educator, is that education isn't going to solve everything here, right? Because in many ways there are particular affective investments in particular structures like settler colonialism or its institutions, right? And so what we need to sort of try to cultivate is, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the RCMP officers that were involved did have some sort of cultural training, right? But if that then fails, why do we keep appealing to that as the answer to all of these things? So I just think we need to be attentive to how we're affectively invested in particular structures, and then how do we divest, I guess, or how do we sort of deconstruct those affective investments in ways that don't facilitate the death of Indigenous youth.
That's great. Thank you very much. I see Joanne's smiling head, which I think indicates that we may be running out of time, but I'll let her provide the details.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Yeah, I think we're rapidly coming to the end of our session today. So before we close out, I did just want to take the opportunity to let everyone know that this event has been the first in a series of events. We'll be organizing over the next several months more webinars in our Indigenous Scholars Lecture Series. And just want to let you know that the Department of Political Science has supported this series, as well as the university's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Enhancement Fund. So we are grateful for that. And so I just want to offer thanks again to our speakers for taking the time to come and share your work with us today. I've seen a number of comments, and we really appreciate the insights you've shared with us. And thank you so much for doing that. And thank you, David, for moderating. And thank you to everyone who took the time out of their schedules to come and take part in this today. So thanks, everyone.